And welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Aaron Gilchrist, and we are seeing the result of an intense sell-off today on Wall Street. It happened amid mixed messages from the Trump administration about the prospects of a recession and growing fears of an escalating trade war between the U.S. and its top economic partners. The Dow today at one point tumbling more than 1,000 points and finishing the session down roughly 900 points you see there. That's a drop of about 2%. The losses were even worse across the other major indices, especially the tech-heavy NASDAQ. That lost roughly 4% of its value today. Now, that slide only adding to the rough stretch for investors after stocks fell across the board last week as well. Let's get right to CNBC senior markets correspondent Bob Pisani. Bob, you've been tracking this all day. Help us understand exactly what happened today.
Well, Aaron, the S&P closed off the low. The S&P 500 is the main gauge that the stock market watchers use, down 2.7%. We're now close to 9% off of the historic highs we hit a while ago. And as you mentioned, there's two concerns. Number one is tariffs. The stock market and investors believe tariffs are inflationary and they could be a drag on the economy. President Trump has said he disagrees with that, but that's what the market opinion is. The other problem that we're having is this is now morphing into broader concerns about a broader economic slowdown. This kind of thing affects consumer confidence, and eventually you start getting slower economic growth in general. Now, the problem is, Aaron, we don't know where the bottom is. If you start believing that there's going to be a broader economic slowdown or even a recession, the stock market could be gyrating for months now as analysts try to figure out exactly what's the earnings picture in the next few months. So this is creating a lot of uncertainty. The tariffs created uncertainty initially, and now there's some concerns about trying to figure out what kind of slowdown are we having right now.
Yeah, Bob, so for folks at home who are watching, help us understand some of what's potentially going to happen here, right? The idea of a bear market versus a bull market, a correction. What are we considering? What are we in for at this point?
The downturn so far is fairly garden variety, believe it or not. As I mentioned, we're almost 9% off of the recent highs. A correction is traditionally considered down 10%. We haven't had one in a while, but it wouldn't be surprising to have one eventually happen. If you want to ask, what do you need to do to sort of stop this? Well, what the market is trying to say right now, if you listen to what it's saying, is they want the tariffs to go away. That's very simple. President Trump could change a lot of this simply by moving on the tariffs and saying they're off the table. It seems, however, and the market is coming to believe that he does not want to do that right now, that for whatever reason, he feels that the negotiating positions he has are very important. So we may actually be stuck with tariff. If that's the case, everybody has to start adjusting some of their earnings expectations downward, because earnings is what really matters for the stock market, Aaron.
So then, Bob, what does conventional wisdom tell us about tomorrow, potentially? If the idea of tariffs are not going to go away, does the market continue to suffer as a result, or does it level off?
We had a really nice bounce today. I mean, we ended down, but we had definitely some trading coming in towards the close. The sense here is that there's been a lot of selling in the last few days. Volume has picked up. It's gotten heavier. So there may be what traders call a short-term tradable bottom. That is, I wouldn't be surprised if we open up tomorrow. The problem is the market can't figure out what kind of economic slowdown are we getting. And as long as that sits around, there's going to be uncertainty. And we're going to be subject to further declines until we be able to figure out exactly what's going on. And I know that's not a satisfying answer, but that really is the state of what we're doing.
No, I appreciate your expertise. Bob Pisani from CNBC for us today. Bob, thank you. Now, the market slide today coming after President Trump wouldn't rule out a recession during a Fox News interview that aired yesterday. Watch.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition because what we're doing is very big. We're bringing wealth back to America. That's a big thing. And there are always periods of, it takes a little time. It takes a little time. But I think it should be great for us. I mean, I think it should be great.
Now, the president was asked about those comments last night on Air Force One, and again would not rule out the prospect of some economic pain in the near term.
Are you worried about a recession? Maria Bartiromo asked you, and you kind of hesitated.
I'll tell you what, of course you hesitate. Who knows? All I know is this. We're going to take in hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs. and we're going to become so rich, you're not going to know where to spend all that money. I'm telling you, you just watch. We're going to have jobs. We're going to have open factories. It's going to be great.
Now, in a bit of a contrast to the president, his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, emphatically told Kristen Welker yesterday on Meet the Press that there will be no recession.
Mr. Secretary, consumer sentiment is dropping. Inflation has ticked up. Major banks like J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs now say a recession in the next 12 months is becoming more likely. Should Americans brace for a recession?
Absolutely not. Anybody who bets against Donald Trump, it's like the same people who thought Donald Trump wasn't a winner a year ago. Donald Trump is a winner. He's going to win for the American people. That's just the way it's going to be. There's going to be no recession in America.
And this morning, one of the White House's top economic advisors told CNBC that he was bullish about the long-term prospects of the economy, while also trying to spin any near-term slowdown as the fault of the prior administration. Meanwhile, new retaliatory tariffs against the U.S. went into effect, including a 15% tariff by China on many U.S. agricultural goods, things like chicken, wheat, corn, cotton. There's also a 10% tariff on products like sorghum, soybeans, pork, beef, and fish, as well as fruits and vegetables. Also today, the Canadian province of Ontario imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity that's coming into the U.S., affecting customers in several states. Now, these tensions between the U.S. and Canada escalating further after Canada's next prime minister addressed his nation with a defiant victory speech yesterday.
The Americans want our resources, our water, our land, our country. Think about it. If they succeeded, they would destroy our way of life. We didn't ask for this fight. But Canadians are always ready when someone else drops the gloves. So the Americans, they should make no mistake, in trade as in hockey, Canada will win.
Joining me now is NBC senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell, business and data reporter Brian Chung, and Jay Gray in Ottawa, Canada for us as well. Kelly, we'll start with you here. We just played President Trump hesitating to respond, really, about these concerns about a recession. Over the last week, we've heard him talk about his tariffs causing, quote, a little disturbance. Is there more concern behind the scenes here than Trump is letting on at all?
That is as far as the president has gone publicly, and we have not seen him yet today, and we hope there may be an opportunity if he were to open up a part of his schedule, and perhaps that would happen after the closing bell to have a better sense of where the market reaction was today. It is not unusual for presidents, this one included, to not want to talk about hypotheticals, but at the same time, the president's policies are creating the uncertainty and the sort of roiling that is happening in the markets and on the world stage as other countries are assessing how they will respond. And it is ratcheting up tensions among friends like Canada and adversaries like China. It is unclear if the president is going to make any additional adjustments. We've already seen adjustments in tariff imposition based on conversations he's had with key leaders or with sectors of the economy. What comes next? Well, we expect that as of Wednesday, there will be additional tariffs on aluminum and steel at a rate of 25%. That will largely hit Canada again, where we get a lot of our imports on those matters. And so for now, the White House is really trying to talk up what a Trump economy will look like and giving a little bit of room for the transition period we're in. This is the 50th day the president's been in office. That's not a long time, but at the same time, he's done a lot of things that have injected uncertainty into the markets and the global relationships. You're
absolutely right on these global relationships. We know that China, as a matter of fact, announced retaliatory tariffs today on some U.S. goods that really target the agriculture sector here in America. Are there any indications at this point of how the president might respond to what China's done?
Well, in broad strokes, he has said that he would respond and match any tariffs that are imposed by other countries. And you're right, these really hit the heartland with the array of farm goods and products that are often sent by American farmers overseas China is a huge buyer of American soybeans, as one example, and that will have a real impact on farmers who need to plan for their crops, need to have a sense of their costs. Their margins aren't great to begin with, and so uncertainty for them can be the difference between a successful harvest, a successful season, or not. So there's a lot of questions there, and certainly in the heartland of America, if you look at the electoral map, there was a lot of Trump country involved there. So these things have real-world consequences for Americans who are in business and in agriculture and in those sectors where our goods go out of the country and have long-standing relationships with other countries who are buyers. And the president, we do expect, based on what he has said, that he would respond in kind with any tariffs that come.
All right, we know you'll be watching closely. Kelly O'Donnell for us at the White House. Kelly, thank you. Let's turn to Brian Chung now. Brian, I want to play what the White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett said on CNBC a little bit earlier today. Watch this.
I'd just be very wary, Joe, of conversations about recession or not, given that we had 2 negative quarters. That used to be a recession under Biden, and then that wasn't a recession. I think that what's going to happen is the first quarter is going to squeak into the positive category, and then the second quarter is going to take off as everybody sees the reality of the tax cuts.
So, Brian, I know he's speaking your language. Does his logic make sense to you? Can tax cuts help to avert a recession?
Well, I mean, in theory, yes, but I want to point out that, first off, we are not in a recession right now. Right. The numbers do not point to that. We just got a jobs report last Friday that showed that the unemployment rate in this country is 4.1%, which is basically in line with what unemployment looked like in the final months of the Biden administration. And yes, it is indeed the case that some define a recession as 2 back-to-back quarters of negative GDP or a measure of economic activity, which we have not seen. We haven't even seen 1 quarter quite yet. But there are some initial readings from, for example, the Atlanta Fed, using more kind of high-frequency data that we get on a weekly basis that say Q1 for 2025 could be negative. Again, we'll have to see once we get that final number in April or so. But look, when you talk about Wall Street, they are pricing in these concerns that these tariffs will lead to some level of uncertainty, which is indeed a drag on the economy. So, yes, when we hear from Kevin Hassett saying, look, we could see 1 quarter of negative growth and then a bounce back, that could be in theory possible. But I do want to point out that and I know that our White House team has been covering this pretty closely. The policy when it comes to tax cuts is not as clear as the tariff policy quite yet. So we're going to have to see the proof in the pudding and the text first before we evaluate whether or not that can account for GDP makeup there.
So on tariffs, we know that some of these new tariffs are in place right now. If we sort of forget about the guys in suits debating trade policy for a second, Brian, when will regular folks start to feel some of the effects of these tariffs, and what might that look like?
Well, Aaron, for the average person, I'm sure it's been nearly impossible to track exactly what happened in the last week. But yes, as you point out, there are tariffs that were put into place on Canada and Mexico, even despite some of the headlines over the exemptions for the automotive industry and for then those goods that are covered under the USMCA, that trade deal that the Trump administration negotiated in the first term. But things like, for example, the 10% tariff, it wasn't 25, 10% tariff on Canadian energy, that is something that the likes of Gas Buddy have warned could impact the prices that we see at the pump as soon as the middle of March, which is not that far away from now. That, when you also include these Chinese tariffs that took impact and took force just today, 10% on those types of agricultural products that you see ahead of you, 15% on other types of products as well. If you are a farmer here in the United States that is exporting to China, which is a major export market for things like soybeans, for things like pork, that is something that you're going to feel almost immediately. But again, I do want to point out that, some of the wide-ranging tariff threats that we've seen from the president, like on the campaign trail, 60% tariff that he's threatening on China. This is just the beginning of that, Aaron.
So one last thing I want to ask you. We know that Ontario just imposed this new 25% surcharge on electricity coming into the United States. Help us understand who exactly that is going to impact and how.
Yeah, this will be news to a lot of Americans who might not even be aware that in basically every state that's east of the Rockies, we have a grid that's plugged into the same energy grid that they use in Canada. However, what we heard from Doug Ford, who is the premier of Ontario, is that he's going to add that 25% surcharge to customers in Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. These are 3 states that do use electricity from Ontario. I don't want to point out there are many other states in the union that also use Canadian power, but I want to point out that when it comes to the grids grids. We're pretty interconnected. It's possible in some cases that we could just kind of plug in the certain supply that we get to use it domestically to avoid those surcharges. I know that the regulator or a group of electricity providers in New York is asking for more clarity over exactly how these surcharges will be implemented, but it does threaten the possibility of electric bills in those states going up. But I do want to point out imports of Canadian electricity, according to the EIA, was only about $3.2 billion in 2023. That's not all that big when you compare it to other types of imports. And again, there might be ways that these states can hedge against those costs as well, Aaron.
All right, Brian Chung covering all the bases for us today. Brian, thank you. We appreciate it. Let's turn to NBC's Jay Gray now, who is reporting from Canada for us today. Jay, we know that there is a new prime minister coming in there. Tell us what you know about Mark Carney.
Yeah, Mark Carney, Aaron, is an economist. He served as the governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He's never held elective office. Carney calls his overwhelming victory last night in his run for Liberal head a mandate. He won with nearly 86% support from his party, and he says that's his mandate to move forward with the Liberal Party's platform, which is focused a lot on what's happening in Washington and the trade war. He'll likely be sworn in the next couple of days. Had a meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau this morning at Parliament, and they discussed the logistics for Trudeau stepping down and him taking that post. He'll then turn around quickly, since he's not a member of Parliament, and call for an election, a federal election, where he will run to keep that post. Most believe it's going to be a close, a contentious race. He is running against the conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, who President Trump has said is more in line with his ideology and someone that he feels like he could work with a bit better.
But Carney seems to be the guy I know going in here, Jay. He had some strong words, which we don't typically say about Canadians, but he did have some strong words about President Trump and his comments about making Canada the 51st state and things like that. What do we know about how Carney might engage with President Trump going forward?
Well, he has said he's going to be direct. He says that one of his initial missions is to stand up to the president and what he calls threat to the actual freedom of Canada. I was at that convention last night. I can tell you that not only from Carney, but others at the podium and in the crowd, there was much more discussion about the tariff tug of war, about the trade war, about that suggestion from President Trump that the U.S. could absorb Canada as its 51st state. Then there were any discussions about problems in Canada or issues within Canada. So this country is highly focused on what's going on here, and has become very nationalized. They are buying Canadian, boycotting American, and doing everything they can, they say, to send a message not only to the U.S. but the world.
And one of those messages, Jay, Brian and I just talked about, Ontario's electricity surcharge that we're seeing now. Are there any signs that other Canadian provinces are looking to impose any sort of price increases on exports to the U.S.?
Yeah, and let's, just for review, remember that it's about 1.5 million American families right now in New York, Minnesota. It's families that are going to see maybe a $100 boost in their monthly bill, so it's significant there. British Columbia in the process of passing legislation that would allow them to put a surcharge on energy that they send over to the U.S. and also allow them to restrict energy imports if they feel that's necessary. We know that there have been discussions with premiers in New Brunswick, Manitoba, Quebec, and Alberta, where Premier Danielle Smith has referred to Canadian energy exports as, and I'm quoting here, a secret weapon and a trump card in the trade war between Canada and the U.S. So, yeah, that's an ongoing discussion. And again, I've been here for a few days. There is a real sense that this is a call to Canadians to stand up, and they are doing so. You said it earlier. They have earned Canadians a reputation internationally as being kind, as being generous, and at times reserved. But I think we're also quickly learning that when they feel like they're being bullied or pushed, that they're quick to stand up and push back.
All right. Jay Gray for us in Ottawa today. Jay, thank you. And still ahead, House Republicans race towards a vote to fund the government, hoping to jam the Senate with just days until a possible government shutdown. Plus, deadly clashes erupt across Syria, reportedly killing more than 1,000 people, mostly civilians. It's the nation's worst outbreak of violence since the collapse of the Assad regime. The latest developments are straight ahead. You're watching Meet the Press now. More uncertainty for the federal government as House Republicans forge ahead with a plan to prevent a shutdown at the end of the week. The funding bill would extend current government funding through the end of September with a moderate increase in defense spending and decrease in non-defense spending. The president has thrown his support behind the bill, which also does not include any specific language about compelling the administration or DOJ to actually use the funds that Congress appropriates. House Democratic leadership urging its members to vote no on that package, saying it is not a clean continuing resolution. Now, with this legislation, or while this legislation can pass the House with only Republican votes, it's a different story in the Senate, where Democrats can filibuster the bill if they choose to. And Michigan Democratic Senator Elissa Slotkin wants assurances on spending from the president before she'd vote yes.
Everyone knows Congress has the power of the purse. So until I see some assurances that whatever we pass next week is going to ensure that the money is spent the way Congress intends, I'm going to withhold my vote until I see that.
NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor is on Capitol Hill for us now. So, Sahil, let's start with this continuing resolution and what's in it. Republicans are calling it a clean CR. Democrats are saying it's not clean. So help us understand here. How clean is it? What's in this package?
Hey, Aaron. Well, it's a 99-page bill. It's essentially a 6-month government funding extension. It's not exactly a clean CR. It's not exactly an appropriations deal either. This is somewhere in between. It's a status quo for the most part, but with some changes in funding. You just went through them. The changes in funding, like a slight increase in defense spending, a slight decrease in non-military discretionary spending. These are all changes that Republicans wanted. So Democrats were basically cut out of the process. It's not a traditional clean CR because typically clean CRs either have no changes at all or changes that were pre-negotiated between both sides. Of course, government funding bills, as we know, have to be bipartisan in order to get through Congress. This is Speaker Johnson negotiating with his own Republican members, cutting Democrats out of the process. Still, he sounds confident that it will get through the House tomorrow when he plans to vote. Take a listen to what the Speaker said earlier today.
If the CR does not pass the House or the Senate, what is the plan B?
The CR will pass.
But what if it gets blocked?
I don't think it's going to get blocked.
What makes you so confident that it's passed?
Because no one wants to shut the government down, and we are governing, doing the responsible thing as Republicans. It's going to be up to Chuck Schumer and the Senate Democrats to do the right thing. And I don't think they're going to shut the government down.
In other words, there is no plan B right now for Speaker Johnson. He is banking on this passing through the House with only Republican votes, maybe a few Democrats, but he's not relying on that at this moment, despite the narrow majority. And he's going to dare Democrats in the Senate to vote it down if it does pass.
Well, you make a point, Sahil, that I was going to ask you about. Hakeem Jeffries and Democratic leadership in the House have been telling their members to vote no on this. Does it seem as though there might be some moderates in the Democratic Party who might cross over here?
That is not clear at this point, Aaron. In previous votes, we have seen some Democrats cross over. In this case, Democrats are somewhat conflicted, but they're angry about a number of things. First, the fact that they were cut out of this process. Usually government funding bills have to be negotiated between the two sides if there are any changes. That didn't happen here. And many Democrats, from the most progressive to the most moderate, are angry about the fact that DOJ and Elon Musk are making these unilateral spending decisions, changing the way spending works, even though it's laws directed by Congress, spending directed by Congress that the executive can't by itself change. So unless something gives here with Democrats, they're going to have a lot of incentives to vote against this bill.
And as you look at this getting through the House potentially, Sahil, what does happen when it gets to the Senate? Are there enough Dems that would cross over there and vote to keep the government open despite their concerns? Or are some of them thinking about creating too much pain as we look at the midterms down the line?
Yeah, it's an open question, Aaron. I think that tally in the House is going to determine the landscape in the Senate. In other words, if it passes with only Republican votes in the House, the landscape looks a lot worse in the Senate in terms of getting to 60. If it passes somehow with a big Democratic vote, a big bipartisan vote in the House, then Democrats in the Senate are going to feel pressured to vote for it. But again, senators typically like to have some say in these government funding bills. Democrats have not had any say in it. So for now, while Senate Democratic leaders are holding their cards close to the vest, unless there are a lot of Democrats who end up bailing this out, I don't think we're going to see a big Democratic vote. I think some of the senators who might be, in theory, most pressed to vote for this are those in the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, including Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia, put out a post just in the last couple of hours saying this is a shutdown bill that's bad for the economy. He said it lets Trump shut down whatever he wants. So in other words, they believe there's already, Democrats do, a partial shutdown going on based on the way Elon Musk and Doge are operating. And this is their only leverage. I can't state this enough. This is the Democrats' only leverage legislatively this year to stop the Republicans and to stop Doge from doing what it's doing.
All right. We know you'll be watching it closely. Sahil Kapoor for us today. Sahil, thank you. And the Department of Homeland Security is taking arguably extreme measures to prevent information on ICE raids from becoming public. Sources tell NBC News that DHS is doing lie detector tests on employees to determine who might be leaking information on immigration operations. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem and Border Czar Tom Homan have blamed lower than expected ICE arrest numbers on leaks revealing planned operation targets. After our report came out, the Department of Homeland Security said in a statement, "We can, should, and will polygraph personnel." We have much more news and politics still ahead. The panel is up next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. More government employees are being offered voluntary buyouts to resign from their jobs, this time at the Department of Health and Human Services. The agency's roughly 80,000 employees received an email on Friday offering lump sum payments of up to $25,000 to resign by this Friday. Now, HHS oversees Medicare and Medicaid, as well as the Centers for Disease Control and other places. The CDC, of course, underwent substantial cuts last month. Now, this move came after President Trump told reporters late last week that cabinet secretaries are in charge of making cuts, but his close ally, Elon Musk, would be doing the cutting if they do not. Joining me now, Michael Schnell, congressional reporter at The Hill, Naveen Nayak, president of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and Rob Bluey, president and executive editor of the Daily Signal. So, Michael, we know that President Trump has said that he's reassured Americans that Congress won't touch things like Medicaid. Now we're hearing HHS is offering mass buyouts here. How is this landing on Capitol Hill?
I suspect it's going to feed into those Democratic concerns about the fate and the future of Medicaid. We heard a lot about that from Democrats when House Republicans passed their budget resolution, which, not to bore everyone with the details, but a high number of cuts from energy and commerce. Medicaid falls under that jurisdiction. A lot of folks saying you can't get to that number without touching Medicaid. Now, President Trump has reassured folks that he doesn't want to significantly alter Medicaid. We've also heard that from House GOP leaders. But of course, when you're talking about messaging in Washington, sometimes those specifics are overlooked. I specifically think that Democrats are likely to run with this, say that there may be some concerns that if specific staffers at HHS take a buyout or are laid off, that could impact Medicaid. So this, I think, will add fuel to the fire. Again, though, folks are going to look at the particulars of what the actual impact of these moves are.
And I was going to ask you, is the White House potentially playing with fire here? As you think about, we talk about the IRS seeing cuts potentially during tax season. Now you have HHS, Medicare potentially seeing job cuts where people are concerned about their health care. It's not popular to cut government it is popular until it touches you somehow. Is the White House playing with fire?
Yeah, I think that we're seeing the rubber hit the road right now, right? We had heard from President Trump on the campaign trail in his beginning weeks in office saying he wants to significantly alter and decrease the size and scope of the federal government. Well, we're actually seeing that come into play. And we've actually heard from several lawmakers up on Capitol Hill, Democrats and Republicans, speaking out about some of these cuts, as you mentioned, when they hit their district. One example, Congressman Derek Van Orden, Republican from Wisconsin, was meeting with Elon Musk in the Capitol last week, and he raised concerns about the impact some of these cuts could have on farmers and veterans, two groups that are significant in his district. So to your point, I think that when it hits folks in their their districts, when they get an earful from constituents at some of these town halls, that's when it may be difficult to defend. But again, we're still working through the process here and seeing what these cuts are.
All right, Rob, I want to play something that President Trump said in the Oval Office last week and then ask you a question about this.
I want the cabinet members to keep good people. I don't want to see a big cut where a lot of good people are cut. I want the cabinet members to keep the good people, and the people that aren't doing a good job, that are unreliable, don't show up to work, etc., those people can be cut.
So we heard the president say he wants to see the use of a scalpel as opposed to a hatchet that people have been saying we've been seeing with Elon Musk to this point. Does it look like he wants these cuts to sort of slow down? Might there be some concern that maybe the speed and style here aren't landing well with folks out in America?
Aaron, I think it's important to take a step back and remember we have a $2 trillion budget deficit, so there will have to be cuts if we want to get to the point of balancing. And I think that's ultimately where the president and Elon Musk want to get. When it comes to HHS or any other department, we also know that many of these employees don't align with the president's agenda. In fact, there was a poll from the Napolitan Institute that came out in January that showed that nearly half of federal managers did not agree with the president and would work against him to resist his agenda. And so I think that if they are offering a buyout and there's a voluntary separation, they should take that opportunity. And that's a way for not only the federal government to save money in the long term, but it's a way for those individuals who aren't in concert with the president to maybe take a different path.
So do you think there's any logic then to people who are saying that the issue is not the what, the issue is the how? People are uncomfortable or bothered by how things have been happening, hatchet, as opposed to scalpel.
As you said, nobody likes to cut government spending, right? They talk a good game, but when it actually impacts you directly, that's when people tend to have issues with it. That's why I think Musk so far has been probably more effective than politicians on Capitol Hill, because he's been willing to make those tough calls. Is it going to affect everybody the same way? Yeah, there are going to be people who are naturally upset. I recognize that, and I have sympathy for those who are affected personally.
Naveen, jump in here. You look like you want to...
Yeah, I think this is madness. And I think we all see it as madness. And I think it was a great story until they actually had to start executing it. We have a bird flu epidemic that's growing in the animal population. Where's the strategy to how to deal with that? We have a measles outbreak in Texas, in New Mexico. Is there any sense that they're trying to protect people who actually do that? This is absolute madness. It's the way you govern Twitter, that is fine. If you want to get rid of the coders and the system falls down, that's fine. What people are learning now is that when you take this approach that Elon Musk and Donald Trump has approved, that every Republican on Capitol Hill owns and is abiding by, people are dying. People like services for veterans are being cut. Child care centers are not opening. People are not being paid. There's real consequences to this approach. And I think it is the way they're governing. And either it's intentional and cruel by nature, or they're just plain old stupid and don't know what they're doing.
We've been watching Democrats and how they've been dealing with or not dealing with some of what's been going on here. And I should say that we know that the Agriculture Secretary has rolled out a bird flu initiative to try to tackle that issue. But for Democrats, back in 2018, Democrats didn't run on sort of the tumult of Trump at the time. They ran on health care. Are there openings here for Democrats that they should be taking advantage of when you think about making cuts to HHS, for example?
Yeah, and I think Michael mentioned that the Medicaid cuts is going to be front and center, and part of that is because Republicans, including Donald Trump, are just plain lying. It is very clear. There's an analysis by CBO that came out last week that said they cannot meet what their budget says without cutting Medicaid. It's plain and simple. So whatever Donald Trump wants to tell you, it is absolutely a lie. And Mike Johnson and everyone else in Congress who's telling you they're not going to cut Medicaid, they are on track to cut at least, and this is clear, at least $880 billion. That's the low end of what they're going to cut. 72 million Americans depend on Medicaid. That is going to absolutely be front and center for the American people. But all these other cuts from DOGE, we're just seeing the effects trickle and grow and expand. And I think it's a huge problem for Republicans.
I just don't see how you get to balance, though, without it. I mean, that's...
Well, why don't you start by not cutting taxes for the wealthy by $5 trillion? That would be a starting point. Republicans are not serious about cutting the budget. That is not something Elon Musk is continuing. I mean, the Washington Post report on this $38 billion that man has gotten from the federal government. He is more than happy to take his share. He's keeping all of that. There's no talk of DOGE, cutting Starlink, cutting Tesla grants. No, no, no. We're going to go after things American people depend on.
And by the way, all Americans do benefit from those tax cuts, not just the
He doesn't need the EV tax credits anymore because his company he thinks is fine.
Michael, I do want to ask you, we talked a little bit earlier about mixed messages on the economy that some folks are expressing concerns about coming from this Trump White House. One of the latest things we heard today was from the NEC director, Kevin Hassett. I want to play this, him blaming some poor economic indicators on Joe Biden.
Near term, we've got a Biden economy that, still most of Biden policies are in place. If you look at the Atlanta Fed GDP now number, it's showing negative first quarter, which is kind of, if you like, a metric of the inheritance of President Biden. This quarter, there are some blips in the data, including the negative GDP now, which are related both to the Biden inheritance and to some, timing effects that are happening ahead of tariffs.
So economic indicators were largely better at the beginning of January, but is this excuse, this idea from the White House, something that's going to last? Are we going to see them be able to blame Biden for any issues that pop up?
Probably not, because the likelihood of that working and being salient among voters decreases as we get farther away from the Biden White House. And I think that we're going to start seeing some more concerns on Capitol Hill from Republican lawmakers about these indicators and about the state of the economy, not to mention that Democrats have been hammering Republicans about it for weeks now. But Republicans are going to continue to hear from their constituents. Prices are rising. The stock market is going down. The Dow Jones closing at down 2% today. These are going to be concerns among voters. And if lawmakers end up getting an earful at some of these town halls, which have so far been noteworthy, so much so that Republican leaders are encouraging their members to have teletown halls and not in-person town halls, they're going to have to start answering for this. And I don't think blaming the Biden White House is going to work as we continue to get through the year. Because, again, you get farther away from the Biden White House, it's going to start to land on Trump's desk. Trump
doesn't have to run again, but there are lots of Republicans who do have to run again. Do we at some point see a break from the party, the rest of the party with President Trump as a result of the fact that he doesn't have to worry about getting more votes?
I doubt it, based on what history tells us. I mean, it seems that Republicans will continue along and support Donald Trump. I will say that one of the indicators that I think Trump should be paying attention to is Americans' personal finances. That was an indicator early on that Joe Biden was not doing well, and it didn't bode well for Kamala Harris either.
I will say that one of the cracks we've already started seeing a little bit is with the tariffs. Some Republican lawmakers raising concerns about the on and off nature of the tariffs and the impacts that they're having on the economy.
Right. We have run out of time. Extra question to you next time around, Naveen. Naveen, Michael, Rob, appreciate you all. Thank you. After the break, a live report from Saudi Arabia, where U.S. and Ukrainian officials are set to meet face-to-face for the first time since President Zelensky's Oval Office meeting with President Trump. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. After a deadly weekend of airstrikes from Russia on Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio both arrived in Saudi Arabia today, as ahead of tomorrow's first face-to-face meetings between the two countries since that contentious meeting in the Oval Office last month. Zelensky is not expected to take part in that meeting tomorrow. Instead, Rubio will meet with several senior Ukrainian officials. According to NBC's exclusive reporting, President Trump now says he wants more than a minerals deal with Ukraine to restart the aid and intelligence sharing that's currently on hold. He wants a change in President Zelensky's attitude toward peace. But speaking to reporters yesterday on Air Force One, President Trump struck an optimistic tone about tomorrow's meeting.
I think you're going to have eventually, and maybe not in the distant future, you're going to have some pretty good results coming out of Saudi Arabia this week. We want to do anything we can to get Ukraine to be serious about getting something done. I say they don't have the cards. Nobody really has the cards. Russia doesn't have the cards. They don't have. What you have to do is you have to make a deal, and you have to stop the killing.
And joining me now is NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simmons in Saudi Arabia, where those meetings are taking place this week. Keir, what are the expectations as we head into this meeting tomorrow between Rubio and the Ukrainian delegation? Should we expect any real deliverables here?
Expectations low, Aaron, I would say. Interesting to hear there, isn't it? President Trump changed his language a little bit. We kind of heard that on Friday, where he threatened Russia with more sanctions if it didn't stop, as he put it, pounding Ukraine, and then you heard him there saying neither side has the cards, which isn't quite what he had been saying, a week ago when he was, very unhappy, as we saw in the Oval Office with President Zelensky saying you don't have the cards. So there are shifts, small shifts, I think, in terms of that meeting tomorrow. What the Secretary of State is talking about is really as a kind of fact-finding exercise. He briefed reporters on the way here in a gaggle. Take a listen to what he had to say.
We're not going to be sitting in a room drawing lines on a map, but just get a general sense of what concessions are in the realm of the possible for them and what they would need in return, and then find out what the Russian position is in that regard, and that'll give us a pretty good assessment of how far apart we truly are.
So critics would say, Aaron, a couple of things, I guess, and more, frankly, wouldn't they? That the Trump administration has been putting pressure on Ukraine primarily and effectively kind of salami slicing or trying to salami slice issues that should be part of negotiations. That's one. The other is that you can actually see on the battlefield the positions of the two sides. For example, the Russians are fighting to try to push the Ukrainians out of that Russian region of Kursk. They appear to be achieving that. It's going to take some time, which raises the question, how really ready is Russia for a ceasefire at this particular stage?
Keir, we also noted that President Zelensky is not going to be in that meeting tomorrow with Secretary Rubio. Is that being viewed in any particular way on either side? Is it being viewed as a snub? What is he hoping to get out of this visit to Saudi Arabia?
I don't think it's a snub so much. I do think that there is an effort to try to repair the damage from that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office for President Zelensky. It's an opportunity, isn't it, kind of overseen by the Crown Prince here in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, as a kind of mediator, for him to potentially, I wonder whether he'll get some time with the Secretary of State, even though they're not supposed to be officially meeting as far as we understand, and where that will be behind closed doors. Very much so, not like the Oval Office meeting. I mean, there's a lot of repairs to be done. So I think that's the purpose, in part, for President Zelensky's trip. As well as remember that the Saudis are close to the Russians. They're also close to the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians will want to maintain that relationship and not, if you like, kind of hand the Saudi relationship over to Moscow.
Keir Simmons in Jeddah for us tonight. Keir, thank you. Let's turn to Syria now, where a wave of violent clashes in recent days has left hundreds of civilians dead. According to the Britain-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, almost 1,000 civilians have been killed in these clashes between Assad loyalists and current government forces since Friday. It's some of the worst violence that country has seen since the fall of the Assad regime last year. The clashes are raising concerns about stability in Syria as the interim government there tries to unite the fractured country that's been devastated by civil war. NBC News international correspondent Matt Bradley is in that region and has more for us.
Yeah, Aaron, well, none of this bodes well for the future of Syria, which has been ravaged by civil war for much of the past decade. Now, we just heard today from Ahmed al-Shara, the leader of Syria's new regime, that the military operations in the western part of the country have basically wrapped up. But there were other reports that there was an outbreak of fighting or clashes inside the capital city of Damascus. And that would be the first time we've seen that since the fall of the Assad regime late last year. So what has happened? This all started late last week when elements of the former regime or loyal to the former regime attacked government forces. This was in the Alawite stronghold of the area around Latakia and Tartus, right near the Mediterranean coast. The Alawites is a religious offshoot of Shia Islam. The former regime of Bashar al-Assad, they are Alawites, so the Assad family. So when there was the attacks against government forces, the government sent in troops over the weekend, and they killed many people, many as 1,400 people. This, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, nearly 1,000 of them were civilians. Now, whether or not we're actually going to see the end of this operation, Ahmed al-Shara, again, the new president of the new regime, has said that he's going to be sending in investigators to try to figure out who is responsible for this massive bloodletting. But this doesn't bode well for the future of this country. Syria has long been riven by sectarianism, and the fact is that while there was a lot of hope for this new regime late last year, this could indicate some fraying of these different groups that divide Syrian society. And this was already a very sensitive and delicate country. This means that we could be seeing more of this kind of violence in the future.
Our thanks to Matt Bradley today for that report. And still to come, nearly 250 measles cases have now been reported across the country, with a Texas outbreak accounting for most of the infections. I'll talk to a top Dallas County health official about the response and how to stop the spread. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. The number of measles cases across the country is growing. There are now close to 250 cases being reported across 14 states. The largest outbreak is in West Texas, where cases have jumped to nearly 200. That's according to the state's health department. As of Friday, 23 people, mostly unvaccinated children, have been hospitalized in that region. One person has died. A health official in Lubbock, Texas, tells NBC News that the number of cases is likely an undercount, since many people are not getting tested. And just across the state line in Lee County, New Mexico, 30 cases have been reported and one person has died. This all comes as the CDC, which is under the purview of Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a longtime vaccine skeptic, plans to re-examine whether there is a link between vaccines and autism. Dozens of studies in the past have found no evidence of any potential link. Joining me now is the Director of Health and Human Services in Dallas County, Texas, Dr. Phil Huang. Dr. Huang, we appreciate you joining us. We know that Texas has the highest number of measles cases in the country right now. How dire is the situation and the fight to stop the spread there?
Well, it is tragic what's going on in West Texas. I mean, there's already been a child death, and it's preventable. And, it's a large community out there of about 25,000 Mennonites is what I hear. And so, I mean, everything's saying that this is not over. This is, as you heard earlier, there are more cases anticipated.
I know that you wrote an op-ed for USA Today recently where you said the path from the elimination of measles in the U.S. in 2000 to an outbreak is littered with disinformation about vaccines, coupled with longstanding disinvestment in our nation's public health system that makes it much harder for us to do our jobs. From your perspective, explain to us how we got to this point.
Well, we have had an effective vaccine. It's safe, effective, and that's why measles was considered eliminated in 2000, and that's why most clinicians have never seen a case of measles. I personally have never seen a case of measles because the vaccine works and it's safe and effective. But unfortunately, recently, there's been more misinformation, disinformation that, people, and after COVID, sort of the anti-vax movement has really gained more momentum. And then, we're also a victim of our own success with this. In that because the vaccine works so well, people haven't seen it and they start to say, well, why do we still need this vaccine? But it's exactly because of the importance and the effectiveness of the vaccine that we haven't seen it.
You also wrote in your piece that much of your health department funding relies on federal support. What sort of support are you getting from the federal government in this fight, and what more do you need?
Well, I know on the ground in West Texas, there's a team from CDC that's out there that's working with the other health departments at the local level. But, also just in Dallas, almost 90% of our health department budget is federal funding. And so these are, anywhere from some of the support for the vaccines themselves to the staff that administer them, to the epidemiologists that follow up and do the case investigations, contact tracing, all of that to try to control these situations, as well as the investment in some of the data systems to be able to track this.
The CDC is planning to re-examine whether there's a connection between vaccines and autism. We've talked about that. This is, of course, despite there being dozens of studies that already show there is no link. What sort of message do you think this sends to parents in Texas in particular who are potentially hesitant to get their children vaccinated?
Well, that's one of the big concerns that we expressed also in that op-ed, that there needs to be a consistent message from the top at the federal level and all through reinforcing that these vaccines are safe and effective. And anything that sort of undermines that or starts to put that into question really is going against our efforts to get people vaccinated and the treatments and things that they need.
So then what is your message to parents then? And what is your message to parents about vaccines and getting their children vaccinated for those parents who may be hesitant to get the MMR vaccine?
Well, again, it's a really simple message is that get up to date on your vaccines. And they've been around, they're effective and safe. And it's why we have not seen measles. But we're starting to see it now because people aren't getting vaccinated. And it's, a death is a tragedy because it is entirely preventable. And that's what, it's really just horrific that we're seeing that.
It's valuable to start at least that conversation with your doctor. If you have some skepticism, go to these trusted sources, talk to the doctors in your community, in your neighborhood about what you need to be doing. Dr. Phil Huang from Texas, the Health and Human Services Department there. Sir, we appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, but the news continues now with Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.